Hello again. As I have said on several of these rebroadcasts of the program we called Broadcast Biographies, recorded in the studios of METV in Bradenton at their very, very kind invitation, and this one was done back in May of 2003. It was our first, after we had been doing them with Rosa Rio and John A. Gambling. Then we turned and did our dear friend Paul Duke. Paul died July 18th of 2005. We recorded this in May of 2003. He was well known on the News Talk Weekend TV world. He had a program called Washington Week in Review. He was, like all of our friends, well established, highly respected, and as you will see, very, very outgoing, very talented people. So if you will, sit back. This runs just short of an hour. That's what all our programs were. They came in just under an hour. This is the broadcast biography, as we did 9 years ago, of our dear friend Paul Duke.
Hello, I'm Don Blair. Welcome to this latest edition of Broadcast Biographies. In our first three efforts, we brought you three radio people. Rosa Rio, the famed organist of the 30s and 40s, John Gambling, of a real dynasty in New York radio, morning radio, and then yours truly, myself, with many years in New York network radio. This time we bring you a very, very familiar face, and we're very pleased to have him with us and very happy with the material that he brought with him. Paul Duke, welcome. Good to see you.
Real pleasure to be here, Don.
Thank you. Listen, we always cut right to the core and immediately ask our guests, where did you come from? Where did things start? Where were you brought up?
Richmond, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm from. Got started in Richmond as a radio announcer, a student radio announcer, if you can believe that, when I was 16 years old.
Sure, I can believe that.
Had my own nightly sportscast when I was 18. Thought I had died and gone to heaven when I got that.
And terribly overpaid, probably.
Went to the local university. The University of Richmond. Graduated, got interested in journalism because a professor in journalism thought that I had some talent, which I didn't think I had.
Yeah.
But it's so important when you're young to have somebody who really has more confidence in you than you have in you. And this was a guy, a wonderful man named Joseph Nettles. And he got me my first job with the Associated Press local bureau in Richmond.
Okay. And where did it kick off from there? I mean, did AP get excited about Paul Duke in Richmond and say, we got to have you in the nation's capital? Or
I would say they were not very excited at all. They were hoping that this young kid who was only 21 years of age might measure up and might make it with the great, powerful Associated Press.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a whole variety of stories with them. I covered... Eventually, I began covering the state capitol, the governor's office, and I covered a lot of the civil rights strife that took place during that period in the 1950s, early 1950s, when Virginia, like some other states, was closing schools rather than submit to integration.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very exciting time. It really was.
Now, you brought us, as I said at the outset, a lot of fine material, which we want to get to here presently. One that I had a lot of fun with, and obviously you did, we're going to show the front page of a paper in Petersburg, Virginia. Could you tell us about that? A great interview you did.
Well, I've said whenever people ask me, what's the most interesting story you've ever covered? And I have to say, the story of the talking horse.
The talking horse.
Story of a talking horse named Lady Wonder. And this is the story. True story. I was assigned to cover a story which broke when the details moved on the AP wire, the eastern wire of the Associated Press, and it was about a boy who had been missing from his home in New England, Stamford, Connecticut. Wow. And this boy, the police had conducted this search for him, and they couldn't find him. Well, two policemen who were headed to Miami, Florida, to pick up a convict and bring him back for trial in Connecticut were driving down old Route 1, which was the major north-south highway in those days. And as they passed through Richmond, on the outskirts of Richmond, there was this huge billboard. It had been there for quite a while, and this woman who was an animal trainer had trained this horse. She had rigged up this giant contraption, kind of like a huge typewriter, with slides and levers, and so it was the thing for young people to go out on a Sunday afternoon and ask this horse, "Have I found my true love?" Because a horse was billed as telling fortunes or similar questions.
This is horse sense.
Horse sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
or horse nonsense.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, true story, these policemen driving down the highway saw this big sign that said, "See, Lady Wonder, can predict the future and has an ability to discover things." So these policemen, true story, stopped and asked the horse what had happened to this boy. The horse on this crude contraption, with a little lady standing there with her switch, the horse pecked out this answer. You know, the horse moved its chin down on this contraption, up shot the lever with a slide that gave the answer, and the answer was L-A-K-E, lake. The policeman, true story, phoned back to Stamford. They dragged a lake, and they found the boy's body. And then, still a true story, the policeman back in Stamford credited the horse in Richmond, in Richmond, Virginia, with solving this great mystery.
And I imagine,
well, it became a nationwide sensation, and I was assigned to cover the story, which I did in a lighthearted fashion.
And you got your picture right on the front page of the paper.
That's another story akin to it. I got a call at 6 o'clock in the morning from AP Wire Photo in New York, saying they'd like a picture of me interviewing Lady Wonder. So there I am, holding my little pad, interviewing the horse. Greatest story I ever covered.
It really kicked your career into high gear, I'm sure. Listen, I want to get into your career in high gear because by the year 1968, my notes say you were with the Today Show, probably even before that, right?
Well,
NBC in Washington.
The AP moved me to Washington, brought me to Washington back in 1957.
Okay.
I was part of a youth movement when they began bringing in some younger reporters because they felt they needed some younger blood in the big bureau in Washington. I worked for the AP there for a couple of years, and then I moved to the Wall Street Journal, where I was a political reporter for a while, and then I went to television in 1963 with NBC, where I did a variety of things, including quite a few interviews with senators and congressmen and other political figures for the Today Show.
And the one we want to look at right now, a very interesting gentleman, maybe not the most outgoing human being I've ever seen, but certainly one of the most intelligent that Capitol Hill ever saw. Let's take a look at Paul interviewing then Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield of Montana. Take a look at this.
Let me now turn to your field, Senator Mansfield, Congress. Just how much support can Mr. Nixon expect from the Democratic Congress?
Well, that will depend on the kind of a program which Mr. Nixon advocates. We have no idea yet as to what he will suggest, but we will lean over backwards to give him whatever support we possibly can, because he will be the President of the United States. He will represent all of us, and we will endeavor at all times to put the future of the nation ahead of the future of the party.
Mr. Nixon has a great many old Democratic enemies in Congress, as you well know. Do you think in the light of this, it's likely we're going to have a very brief presidential honeymoon?
That's possible, and I'm sure Mr. Nixon is aware of that and will do what he can to alleviate the possibility of such a situation. We will go more than halfway to work with President-elect Nixon in the interest of the nation.
Do you have any plans to meet with Mr. Nixon soon?
No, none at all.
Has he been in touch with you?
No.
Senator Mansfield, you knew Mr. Nixon when you served in the House with him and later when he presided over the Senate when he was vice president. What kind of a president do you think he'll make?
I think based on the years which have elapsed and the experience which he has accrued, that he will make a good president. He is certainly aware of the difficulties which confront this nation, both at home and abroad. He will have to face up to them, and I think he will now that he will assume the responsibility shortly. And I wish him the best of everything in the years ahead, because he will be the president of all of us, and what he does or doesn't do will determine our destiny for a long time to come.
Mike Mansfield, what was your impression after that interview, and what is your impression of Mike Mansfield today?
Don, the most taciturn politician I ever knew. He was, as you could tell from that interview, I think, he was the kind of political leader that you could interview and he would give you a lot of, you'd ask him a question and he'd say yup or nope, or he'd give you a single sentence response. And so whenever you asked Mike Mansfield, and he incidentally was a very good leader for the Democrats in those days, whenever you asked him one question, you had to have your follow-up question ready to go, because there was no time to waste.
That's what strikes terror in all our hearts, is the one-word answer after you pose a very intelligent question. And he says, nope. Yeah, okay, I want to move on a few years. You went from NBC when? When did you go over to PBS?
I was with NBC for 10 years, and then in 1974, in early 74, I went to PBS, which had just begun a news operation in Washington.
It's funny, because that's the year I came to NBC. You went over to PBS, and I hit New York at the height of Nixon's problems, and you went on the air with a gentleman named Jim Lehrer with some very, very memorable video.
Well, that was the Watergate period, if you remember, Don. And I covered Watergate for NBC before I went to PBS. In fact, I covered the famed Senate Watergate hearings, and, you know, everybody emphasizes Deep Throat and Woodward and Bernstein, but there were, I mean, the rest of us also had some good sources. And I got to tell you, I've never talked about this very much, but you were at NBC and I was at NBC. And when I was covering the Watergate hearings, which really did seal Richard Nixon's fate because of all the revelations that came out about the skullduggery that was going on. Anyway, at one period during these hearings, documents began to flow from the White House under lock and key to the committee. And they tried to keep them very secret. But I had a source on that committee
who shall remain unnamed,
who agreed to give me some of these documents, and they made great stories. He wouldn't give them to me on Capitol Hill. We had to rendezvous about 6 blocks away, and he gave me this material, and it made great stories for the NBC Nightly News.
I'm sure it did.
And to this day, I have never revealed the name of that source.
Your own Deep Throat. Yes. Listen, this is you and Jim Lehrer, the wonderful Jim Lehrer, who is still on PBS
these were the follow-up impeachment hearings, and that was the first big story that I covered with PBS.
Okay. Now take a look and notice the Jim Lehrer hairdo. I love this. This is cute.
Another historic milestone has now been reached in the Watergate case. The House Judiciary Committee today approving the first article of impeachment. 27-11 was the vote on the article, which charges the president with an obstruction of justice in the handling of the Watergate case. This, of course, means that a resolution of impeachment approved by the committee is now certain to go to the House floor. It is only the second time in our history, only the second time, that a congressional committee has approved articles of impeachment against the president. Jim?
And on Monday, the committee goes on to consider further articles of impeachment, and we'll be back on most of these PBS stations with our nighttime coverage at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, for our guests, Bill Van Alstyne and Martin Diamond, and for Paul Duke and our Impact colleagues, I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
From Washington, you have been watching videotaped gavel-to-gavel coverage of the House Judiciary Committee proceedings.
Okay, and as we said, Jim Lehrer is still going strong down on PBS, and what, still WETA? Was your base in Washington?
That's the broadcasting station, the major broadcasting station for Washington News out of Washington, and Jim is still there. And of course, the PBS NewsHour is one of the best news programs in broadcasting.
I know, and later on we're going to see a comment in tribute to you at your retirement time of Gwen Eiffel, who I think is wonderful, and she, like you, came over from NBC.
Right.
And they
Listen,
get some
NBC
great talent.
is the farm system for public broadcasting.
Why not?
Sandy Van Oker was at NBC.
Yeah.
Robin McNeil was at NBC. Yeah. I was at NBC.
Right.
PBS wouldn't exist without NBC.
Yeah. Did you find it compared to NBC that PBS was like going to a quieter world where you could be more of your own man?
Well, that's the reason I went to PBS, because I reached a stage in my career when I felt that there was too much of what I was doing at NBC that was on the superficial side. And I felt like I wanted to go to a broadcast organization where my experience and my abilities, such as they were, would be put to the best use.
Okay.
And PBS, in the early days when I went there, covered a lot of congressional hearings and a lot of live events. And I've always loved live broadcasting.
Yes.
Because I think that's the true test of your mettle. It's got to be in your head.
Yeah.
You know, you can't just read a script.
Yep.
You know, when you're broadcasting live, you've got to have a fund of knowledge.
Think on your feet.
Right.
Now, when did Lawmakers come into your life? A program called Lawmakers.
Well, I did a lot of things when I was at PBS, and at one point we did a weekly program. It lasted for about 4 years, and then our funding dried up. But I did a weekly program where we introduced a new young star, Cokie Roberts, who, as you well know, went on to ABC and is a very fine reporter.
Yes.
And that was a program that, it was my idea that so many things go on in Congress, and Congress is, to my way of thinking, a microcosm of the country, because people come and serve in Congress from all walks of life, representing all kinds of professions. And television has done a very poor job of reflecting what happens in Congress. So my idea was to do a weekly program just showing as much as we could, as in an unvarnished way, what was going on at the nation's capital.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that.
Mm-hmm. But in this instance, correct me if I'm wrong, but you did the Reagan interview while you were doing the Lawmakers show, yes?
I did an interview with Ronald Reagan, primarily about his relations with Congress. Right.
Exactly. And that's it. You're asking Ronnie Reagan, what is it about him that makes him so popular on Capitol Hill? Watch this.
Mr. President, you came to town like Jimmy Carter as an outsider, but the results have been vastly different. How do you explain your mastery of the legislative branch?
Well, I don't know whether I'd have the nerve to use that word mastery as you did, but I had 8 years experience as governor of California, in which for about 7 of those 8 years, both houses of the legislature were of the opposing party, and we managed to get a great many reforms in, the welfare reforms that were so tremendously successful, things of that kind. But I came here with the same idea that we're co-equal branches of the government. They've got their problems, and it's a case of common sense and consultation. And I've had 11 formal meetings with the leadership of the House and the Senate here. I've gone to the Hill 9 times myself, and I understand that, that for 18 months that's kind of a record.
Senator Baker, the Republican leader, said that you have an instinctive feel for how the legislative branch works, and others who've come down to the White House say that you've also capitalized on your charm and your personality and your persistence. And I am wondering, did acting give you the training and the skills to sell your program to Congress?
Well, I suppose we're all the sum total of everything that's happened to us and all the experiences we've had in our lives. So whether that contributed something or not, I don't know. I must say this, about getting along with the legislature. I am deeply indebted to Senator Howard Baker and to Representative Bob Michael, the minority leader in the House, for the great cooperation and the help that I've had from them, the masterful job they've done in those two positions that they hold as leader of the Senate and minority leader of the House. Also, when I say consultation and I find that the job of keeping track of what's up there, of not pulling surprises, of letting them know. We have a group in the administration here that is appointed expressly for the purpose of legislative strategy, to keep track of our own proposals. And I try to remember that the President proposes and the Congress disposes, to keep track of these things. If there is something that we feel we'd have trouble with and that perhaps have to find ourselves in a veto position, we see that they're aware of that and what it is that gives us that or puts us in that position in advance, and then keep in constant touch. And it doesn't hurt every once in a while in keeping in touch to say some thank yous.
Well, you go beyond that, though, Mr. President, because when you talk to people on the Hill, there's a common refrain that comes through. They all say, we go down to the White House, and Ronald Reagan is a terribly charming man.
There is Mr. Reagan. Charming. I mean, he could charm the leaves off the trees. You know, you said that, Mike Mansfield was rather taciturn, quiet. Ronald Reagan was not.
No, that's right. But I have to say this, Don, when I did that interview, it was most interesting. And he was certainly a very gracious man to interview. And, somebody said Ronald Reagan put a smile on the face of the Republican Party.
Isn't that nice?
I think that's absolutely right. But I also had the feeling when I was interviewing him and having interviewed a great many politicians that Ronald Reagan kind of had a cue card mind. When you put a question to him, he would punch up file number 17.
He was programmed for it.
And out would come the answer.
I see.
And so there was a certain amount of repetition to...
showbiz?
Showbiz, you might say.
Oh, yeah. But still, a very charming man.
No
and then,
question.
as we'll see in later video that you brought with you, you also were an eyewitness and certainly a reporter on the crash of that administration. But let's getting ahead. We're about to look at an anniversary edition of Washington Week in Review, which you hosted for how many years?
20 years.
20 years.
Well, I did it for 20 years, from 1974 to 1994. And then I came back for a very brief period when they asked me to return after they had a dispute with a man who succeeded me, Ken Bodie, and so I came back for about 8 months and did the program while they were searching for a new moderator. I was not interested in coming back on a permanent basis.
Well, I selected this piece of the material you provided to me because it's the lengthiest piece in our program today. But it really shows you and your colleagues at work. And that was, I would say, that was really the big work that you did in Washington, by which we all know Paul Duke, Washington Week in Review. So let's look at this, and I think it's a wonderful montage of what happened to the Nixon presidency, which you put together in a very fast-moving episode here of Washington Week in Review. Here it is.
Washington Week survived, and Watergate continued.
President Nixon refuses to give any more tapes to the Watergate special prosecutor. One of the stories tonight on Washington Week in Review. Here is moderator Paul Duke.
Good evening. There have been more significant developments this week in the Watergate case. And
Those were my opening lines as I joined Washington Week in February 1974, just as Watergate was casting a darker shadow over the Nixon presidency.
The central question remains President Nixon's complicity or lack of complicity, guilt or innocence in this whole affair.
6 months later, Richard Nixon resigned.
Peter, you were at the White House all day today. What was it like?
Well, let me start with the East Room of the White House, Paul, where a remarkable changing of the guard occurred without pomp, without precedence, as we know. The East Room is a scene of historic events, ceremonies of all kinds, from news conferences to diplomatic receptions, swearing in of cabinet officers to entertainments. Well, today we got the former president, Mr. Nixon, saying his valedictory to his staff, to his cabinet, to his official family. And it was vintage Nixon. It was quite different from his speech, his resignation speech on last night. I'm getting my nights and days mixed up here, Paul. But it was all of the bitterness that Mr. Nixon contained in his resignation speech came out in that long, rambling discourse before his cabinet and his staff in the East Room. His bitterness against the press, his bitterness against his enemies, his bitterness against those who would suggest that the Watergate principles feathered their own nest.
During those years, the star of the program had become the witty, straight-talking Peter Lissagore. Lissagore graced our presence for 9 years, and then one night in December 1976, I had to make the saddest announcement of my broadcasting career.
Good evening. Peter Lissagore died today. He died of cancer.
The passing of Peter Lissagore was the passing of an era. Soon, new faces began gathering round our table to discuss a new presidency.
President Carter's persistent quest for peace in the Middle East finally has paid off. The president has won the daring gamble he took in flying to Egypt and Israel for one last try at bringing the old enemies together. All the signs are a peace treaty will be signed in 10 days.
The Camp David Treaty Accord was Jimmy Carter's finest hour. His cabinet shakeup a few months later was one of his worst.
It seems to me that an awful lot of the criticism, an awful lot of the problems is not what Jimmy Carter did in the sense of replacing people, but the extraordinarily amateurish way, at least according to a lot of Washington politicians, in the way it was done. First of all, does the White House now acknowledge that? Was there any feeling as the week progressed that they were not doing it in the right way?
Well, I don't think the White House officially acknowledges it, but there are people within the White House who will tell you not only that did they do it badly, but that it may have seriously affected Carter's chances for re-election.
Those chances for a second term were damaged irreparably by the 1979 Iranian seizure of U.S. hostages.
The Iranian crisis is now in its 6th day, Hank. Any sign of a break?
The United States is taking the approach to this that one takes when there's a hijacking, for example. There is no military alternative without losing the American citizens of that embassy. There's no way you can go take them out.
In fact, the hostages didn't get out till January 20th, 1981, the very day Jimmy Carter turned the White House over to Ronald Reagan.
For the past 6 years, our focus has been on one man, Ronald Reagan, who brought great change to the Capitol. He was swept into office in November 1980, and as I said then, a major break with the past was in store. Good evening. The political earthquake that reverberated across America last Tuesday will bring many changes to Washington. A much more conservative White House, a much more conservative Congress, and perhaps a new conservative era. In the process, we're certain to have new policies to try to solve the country's long-standing economic problems and to build up American power and prestige abroad.
He said, I represent all Americans, and it was in a sense that he understood that you have to reach out.
My fellow citizens, our nation is poised for greatness. We must do what we know is right and do it with all our might. Let history say of us, these were golden years.
Ronald Reagan's optimism has been the secret of his popularity and helped a lot with Congress.
Once again, Rick, that old master Ronald Reagan has proved that he's the best acting president we've ever had.
You know, there just is an enormous amount of Reagan magic. I was talking with some of the leaders of Congress about the president. They said when he came up there in the little room where they met with him, before he went out to give his speech, he was in a jovial mood, and he came out and he just gave an absolutely vintage Reagan performance.
And the great communicator chalked up some big legislative victories. One of the biggest was tax reform.
It's going to go down as a major legacy, I think, of Ronald Reagan's administration, closing loopholes, bringing down rates, less government, a big plus for Ronald Reagan.
The president also pushed for greater American involvement in Nicaragua and big increases in the military budget.
The Gipper wins another defense battle, Charlie.
Is that a question?
A comment and the question, how did he do it?
Yes, the president won on the MX, and we're going to have another 21 for 42 in all, and maybe that will be in all. This was a knockdown, drag-out thing when it was all over. Vic Fazio, the Democrat of California who supported it, said they were about like a bunch of punch-drunk fighters in the last rounds.
Mr. Reagan also tried hard to restore America's prestige abroad, but in foreign policy, the going proved a lot tougher. Relations with the Soviet Union have remained deadlocked, and at the Iceland summit, there was a breakdown in the arms control negotiations.
The president got up from the table, folded his papers up when they had reached an impasse on the Star Wars or on the Strategic Defense Initiative, and Gorbachev got up and folded his papers up and followed him out to the car, and on the way there, Gorbachev kept saying, well, we can still deal, we can still deal, and the president said, I don't think you want a deal, I don't think you want a summit.
In the Middle East, there's been the frustrating fight against terrorism.
It seems to me that the administration is so committed to the notion of retaliation that it has to do something in the aftermath of this.
Rather than retaliate, the White House began secret talks with Iran, precipitating the greatest crisis of the Reagan presidency.
Good evening. Once more, an American presidency is beleaguered by scandal. Once more, we face the prospect of weeks and months of investigations that will cast a damaging shadow over the U.S. government. This, the consequence of this week's startling disclosure that money from the sale of military equipment to Iran was diverted to help fight a war in Nicaragua, that the whole scheme was masterminded from the White House. Are we seeing the collapse of the Reagan administration?
The answer is we don't know.
He has it in him, and he has the constituency that wants to help him out in the country.
He's still a popular president.
If he acts fast and if he acts in a big way.
I think the greatest thing he's got going for him besides his personality is that the American people do not want to see another failed presidency. Absolutely. They really don't want to.
That was 3 months ago, and the story has only grown since then.
That, Paul, was on the 20th anniversary, 1987, yes? 20th anniversary of the show, not necessarily of your tenure there.
Right.
Yeah. And you stayed on, as we said, into the 1990s. Okay. Now, we got a man named Clinton that came about in, as a matter of fact, this was on, according to my notes, your next to the last Washington Week in Review. You went up to the White House. Was it in the Oval Office or the library? Because Reagan was in the library.
It was in an office right off of the Oval Office.
Okay.
It was not in the Oval Office itself. Well, that's right. And you know, Washington Week was a program which featured the leading reporters in Washington.
Yes.
People who were actually covering the stories, not pundits.
Could you select them, or did producers select them?
Well, the producers and I worked together on choosing the people who were on the program. We had basically a team of about 8, 9 reporters from which we chose. I mean, if there was a big story in a certain area where their expertise did not come into play, then we would go beyond the team and we would bring on somebody else. But it was a program that worked, I think, Don, because there was a certain camaraderie, and it was fundamentally a reporting program. People were telling you what they had learned during the week, and I always thought that it was more important for a television news program to tell you, for a reporter to tell you not what he thinks, but what he knows, and that's what we emphasize.
Okay. In this interview with Clinton, I picked out this particular cut because I think his comment on what the White House represents is just irony personified. Here it is with President Bill Clinton.
Harry Truman said that he found a lot of frustration in the job, and one of the things that frustrated him the most was trying to persuade people to do the things which he felt they should have sense enough to do themselves without being persuaded.
There's a lot to that. But that's partly because so many people see the world differently. I mean, I find that with this healthcare issue in which I'm embroiled now. I personally can't understand how we can justify as a nation not providing health security to all Americans. I don't understand how we can even explain it to ourselves that all these other advanced countries have found a way to guarantee basic health care to all their families, and we don't provide it to everybody, and nearly anybody can lose their health care at any time. So to me, that's an example of something where I'm spending an immense amount of time trying to persuade people, in this case in the Congress, to do something they ought to do without my asking. But that's what makes up democracy. People have wildly and different views of what is and is not acceptable and how to move forward.
Do you see the White House as a command post for change, to lead the country to do these things which you feel are essential that it do?
I think that's what it is now. I think it's other things as well. The White House is always the repository of the basic values that make America work. The respect for the Constitution and the laws, the respect for one another, the things that make a democracy and civility possible. But in this case, when so much needs to be done, the White House needs to be the command post for change. Since this is not a dictatorship, it is an office ultimately of persuasion, of working with people and getting agreement to move forward. But I think that's what historically the White House needed. I think that's why I won the election. I believe that I won because enough people thought I could be an instrument of the right kind of change. Otherwise, there was no point in my coming here.
Now, when Washington Week first went on the air, you were, back in 1967, you were a student at Georgetown, and you were a part-time aide to Senator Bill Fulbright, a senator that I used to cover when I was a reporter on Capitol Hill. And you saw Washington through the eyes of Capitol Hill. And now that you're at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, do you see it quite differently?
I do, in some ways. If you remember, in 1967, that was the period where we were building up our involvement in Vietnam to the point in 1968 when we had over 500,000 soldiers there. And there was a real sense on Capitol Hill that maybe the Congress should be more involved in these decisions. Maybe they should be slowing them down or reshaping them. Maybe this was diverting America from its domestic purposes. Remember, just a year before, we'd had the riots in Los Angeles, for example. So I was then, I suppose, part of the widely held view at the time that we needed a stronger Congress, that we needed to somehow restrain the imperial presidency. And when I got down to this end of Pennsylvania Avenue, I respect very much the prerogatives of the Congress, but things like the filibuster rule and the ability of a minority of one house of Congress to shut down what the majority of both houses might want to do along with the president have proved more frustrating to me. So maybe it's just at different times. Maybe it's that I'm on a different end of the street.
But you sound like you're saying, really, that Washington has changed you since you have come back here and since you've moved into the Oval Office.
Well, I think this job changes everybody. I think it should. If you don't grow in this job, and if you don't deepen, if you don't become less obsessed with yourself and your position and more obsessed with the American people and their condition and their future, you can't really be a good president. And I think what that means is, if you get up every day and come here and you're really fighting for what you believe in, you want to be able to succeed. And I think that I don't know that Washington changed me about that. I just ran for president because I thought it was the vital center of action, as President Kennedy used to say, and that I ought to do what Truman said I should do, just try to persuade people to do what they should do.
William Clinton, with some very, very candid comments that it was almost as though, do as I say, not necessarily as I do or did. Then, almost in the same time period, you had a farewell luncheon at the Washington Press Club?
That's right. When I was singing my swan song,
and wrapping it up,
the National Press Club invited me to come and to give my assessment of Washington journalism and what was and the caliber of television reporting that was going on in broadcast journalism. And I had some I must say, I had some very frank opinions.
Yes, you did. I put it down as Paul's State of the Media address, your annual State of the Media address. You went on at length, but I tried to cull about a 5-minute section in which you really tell what is on your mind. And this is his comments on the media as it's been and as it is. Paul.
In almost half a century of writing and reporting and broadcasting, I've witnessed and reported on any number of follies, most of which all of you here today know too well. The futile struggle over segregation, the Vietnam War, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and Ronald Reagan's notion that we could have it all and never pay for it. As Groucho Marx once quipped, politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. It is our business, the press's business, to chronicle all the deeds and misdeeds. And clearly the press is no more perfect than the politicians or the policymakers. There is too much careless reporting today, too much cynicism, too much reliance on unnamed sources, and too much instant analysis, which all too often turns out to be instant baloney. The news business has changed like everything else, and in the case of television, some of the change is for the better. Today's viewers have a much broader menu of broadcast news than ever before, with a steady expansion of informational programming on cable, CNN, ESPN, C-SPAN, Court TV, and so forth. Television has become the great national marketplace for the great issues of the day, and it certainly enables us to get to know our public officials better. We see them nightly on McNeil-Lehrer or Nightline or on the weekend programs, thus contributing substantially to public accountability. Just think for a moment back to the 19th century, when most Americans never, ever knew what their president looked like, much less hear him speak. Television has become a mighty force in shaping public policy, as we know from the civil rights struggles, Vietnam, and more recently, Somalia. It has become the great window to the world, permitting us to watch Man on the Moon, the Berlin Wall tumbling down, and the freedom fighters of Tiananmen Square. And along with all of this, television has introduced us to so many interesting and engaging people that we'd never otherwise meet. Television can be, and often is, a powerful educational force, as consistently proved by McNeil-Lehrer or Bill Moyers, who has made intelligent conversation an art form, or Charles Kuralt, the poet laureate of CBS Sunday Morning, one of the best news programs anywhere. Now, having said all this, having cited the good news, I must also say that all change does not equate with progress, nor does more news necessarily translate into better news. In some very basic ways, the medium that Edward R. Murrow once exalted as the biggest classroom in the world has become a widespread slum, populated by electronic barbarians. Hence, for a good part of TV news these days, it is onward and downward, with style prevailing over substance and ratings over reporting, real reporting. Because the standards have been lowered, there is a greater blurring of fact and fiction, with entertainment values frequently taking precedence over journalistic values. Thus, the trend toward tabloid-type programming, the increased emphasis on sex and sleaze and sensationalism, and the disregard for context and perspective in favor of snappy sound bites growing ever more brief. One of the worst things has been the decline of the single-issue documentary, once television's pride. Although I must say here that PBS is trying to keep the faith in this area with programs such as Frontline and Rick Smith's recent series on competitiveness. But not only are outstanding documentaries few and far between these days, but they rarely pack any wallop. Instead, the notion that news is entertainment has spawned a flashy and slurpy brand of programming that leans heavily on sob stories or celebrity interviews. Shows that are little more than video versions of the old Hollywood movie magazines and the Police Gazette. Thus, what we've seen is the news business becoming more like show business.
All right. We are getting through a lot of good material here. Very, very interesting stuff. You talked about, you actually closed that piece by referring to the business that we've both been in most of our lives as getting to be too much show business for you. I've heard Cronkite say that. We've heard Brinkley say that. You haven't changed that opinion, have you?
No, as a matter of fact, I think it's become even worse.
Really?
And one of the things that I abhor today in broadcast journalism, and it goes on all the time on the cable news channels, is what I call ideological warfare. They like to get somebody from the left and somebody from the right, and have them duke it out. Well, you and I might really enjoy that for a while, but that is not my idea of enlightening journalism. And I think when the cable channels first began, I think there were a lot of longtime journalists like me, Don, who felt, boy, this should be great because they'll really be covering the things that matter. They'll be covering the stories that journalists should be covering all over the world and all over the United States. Hasn't happened. No. And that's a matter of great regret for me and a lot of other journalists as well. I just think it's a big disappointment.
Yeah, it's a very, very bottom line business.
Bottom line, that's right. And you have the feeling that the money changers have taken over in broadcast journalism. Mm-hmm. You know, Don, when I was at NBC, you were at NBC, of course, too, and you never had the feeling in the old days, in the 60s or 70s, that the news division had to make a profit.
That's right.
You know, all of that is dramatically changed.
You didn't have bean counters looking over your shoulder.
Didn't have bean counters, right.
Now, among the tapes, and this will probably be our final shot at going to the videotape, as the saying goes, is a compilation of tributes, of farewell Pauls to you by people in all facets of the business. By that I mean your competition. Mm-hmm. And, well, I'll let them say it, and then I'll cap it afterwards. But this is a beautiful piece of tape, and I'm so glad you brought it along because you have a lot of friends, did and still do, and we start with one of the more loud personages on public television, the McLaughlin Group. Let's take a look.
Issue 1, the Duke rides off into the sunset.
He's one of this town's good guys, in my opinion. You all know him. Sam?
Well, yes. Frankly, though, David, I'm kind of glad he's retiring. I get letters from people saying, why can't you be polite and thoughtful like Paul Duke?
Well, why can't you?
Why can't you?
One time, I was at an airport, and a lovely woman came up to me and said, you know, I love that show you do on Friday nights, but I really want to ask you one question about the host. And I said, sure, ask me anything you want. She said, what's Louis Rukeyser really like?
Basically, what the audience sees is what you get. A natty guy with a taste for ties, but there's some things that you don't see. And you will not believe Paul Duke's taste for corny jokes.
People just don't understand there's an emergency. It's too abstract.
Well, I have a special emergency at this point that always arrives about this time.
Paul and I have worked together for years. We did a television program together on Congress called The Lawmakers. It was a little of a shock for Paul to have a girl or two working with him, but now he's gotten used to it.
One of the things that came to mind is when I first met him, which is when I first arrived on the set of Washington Week. So I walk in, and Paul is very nice to me, but very kind of cool and brusque. And after the show is over, I'm waiting for some sort of judgment. He says nothing at all. And then he turns to me at one point and he says something like, well, you know, Gwen, you actually speak too quickly.
A couple of weeks ago,
I was in Moscow for President Clinton's summit meeting with Russian President Boris Yeltsin.
Doyle, you've been with the president every inch of the way on this trip. What is your impression about how he has done, how he's fared?
What you couldn't see was that I was standing next to an open window, and the temperature in the middle of January in Moscow was about 15 degrees. I was freezing to death right there on camera. And Paul Duke was the picture of solicitous concern. He looked at me on his monitor and he said, Doyle, he said, try not to let your teeth chatter.
Paul Duke, people may not know, is a Cooperstown class baseball fan. Knows lots about baseball, which is serious, which means that I would expect he would come back from England in due time and spend a lot of time at Camden Yards in Baltimore.
He's retiring, and I'm not, and I don't get it. He only has to work 1 day a week. I've been working 5 days a week. I should be the one retiring, but can't have everything.
Paul Duke is young at heart and strong in spirit and ready for his next challenge.
Paul Duke, hail and farewell, partner. But after a break, please, don't be away too long.
Congratulations, Paul, on a wonderful career. Good luck in your retirement. Have a good time in London. There'll be a lot of days when I wish I could be there with you.
And a final farewell and best wishes from William Jefferson Clinton.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, that was very nice, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
You know,
you know what they said, and this is what I want to impress here. So great to open with McLaughlin because he bellows. And he sometimes browbeats his good friends on the panel. What do you mean by that comment? And you're so far off base and everything else. But various people like Haynes Johnson and others of your good friends, and I'm sure the late Peter Lissagore would say the same thing if he were with us now, is that the reason the camera liked Paul Duke and your colleagues liked Paul Duke is because you were so balanced and in control and fair. They liked that nobody shouted at one another. You wouldn't allow it, would you?
No, that's very true. It's just not my style, and I think as a broadcaster, as in life, I think you should be true to yourself, Don. I consider myself a very lucky guy. I can truthfully say that I never had a job that I didn't really like, and I've worked with a lot of really great people everywhere along the way, and I just, well, I like to quote something which the critic H.L. Mencken once said, that journalists lead the lives of kings.
Really? Oh.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Maybe not all the time, but most of the time.
Yeah. I didn't bring the copy in here, so I don't know if you could paraphrase that comment about journalism, journalists. I think it was a famous writer who characterized the career of a journalist, which you often pick up and read.
Well, you're talking about the famous comments by Stanley Walker, who was a great New York City editor back in the 1930s, and he made this speech in which he would go on at some length about journalists and how women adored, this was obviously during the period when most journalists were males, and he said women adore him, politicians look up to him, ordinary citizens admire him, and when he dies, some people remember him for several days.
For several days. That's nice to contemplate, isn't it? But I think he kind of hit it right on the head, and I think most of his comment was a little bit tongue-in-cheek even then, wasn't it? About being so adored. I mean, these days we're excoriated as being the liberal press and every other kind of thing.
Today, I think so much of, I mean, journalism has taken on a glamorous aura in these days.
Showbiz.
But I still remember what the great columnist Walter Lippmann once said, that journalism is the last refuge of the vaguely talented.
Sounds like something Dorothy Parker might have said, you know, one of those. And, you know, satire is so great when it hits things right on the head, too, you know. But listen, I could wind up here by asking you, now that you are at least a Floridian with us part of the time of the year, what is Paul Duke's life today? I mean, you still dabble and go back in and do occasional documentaries, do you not?
I do, and Don, I suppose if you've been a journalist, it remains in your blood. as long as there's blood to flow through your veins. And I still do occasional documentaries. I've done documentaries. I like to tell stories. I did a documentary on the great upset of '48, how Harry Truman beat Tom Dewey in the greatest political upset in our history. I did one on the dramatic battle between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy in 1960. And
you also did the Berlin airlift.
I did one on the Berlin airlift, which probably was the greatest rescue operation in history. So I keep my hand in, and I like it that way. But I have to tell you, I also like the relaxing life in Sarasota.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you picked the right place. And you still have roots back in Washington, D.C., do you not?
That's still my basic residence in Washington.
So you what we call a snowbird down here then, right?
That's right. That's right. And I like being a snowbird, as I said. The thing about this area is you not only meet a lot of very nice, friendly, stimulating people here, but there are just so many different activities, and there's such a tremendous cultural component to this area too.
Yes, there is.
That you can be here and never be bored.
If you are, then you're doing something wrong, I think, because there is so much to do down here. You're really right.
Right.
And we didn't come on the air to do a Chamber of Commerce piece.
No.
But obviously we love where we are, and or we wouldn't be here. But I'm glad you're here, Paul Duke, and I'm glad we finally were able to wangle you into this studio, because you do have activities which, right up until recently, made us change our little taping schedule for this program, but we got you in before you head back up north again, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Do you ever go up to Capitol Hill, or do you ever sit with the boys and just chin and talk with the guys that are still very much in the business, like Jim Blair?
Sure. As a matter of fact, the members of my old Washington Week team, all of whom have retired as well, we keep in touch. We see one another. We have dinner together quite frequently. And I think that was one of the secrets to Washington Week's success, because I had so many people who would come up to me and say they not only enjoyed the show, but they also felt like we really liked one another, and it's very true.
This is true. It came across the camera.
Right. Yeah. And that's very important in television, you know. If you convey that to the viewer, I think first and foremost, the viewer, if you're in news, the viewer has to trust the person who's delivering the news. You know, you have to establish a certain connection and rapport, you know, to make it work.
Right. Well, even Sam Donaldson said he is so nice, and then, you know, who was it? McLaughlin said, well, why can't you be like that? Sam Donaldson could never be. Paul, it's been a pleasure, and it's been wonderful to look at back into your life, into your history. I'm glad you brought us all such wonderful material. Thanks for being with us on Broadcast Pioneers.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. This is Don Blair. See you next time.